Hi, and welcome to our first biannual Research Rumble. This is a research debate. Today it's going to be more of a discussion, however, but the subject of our discussion is going to be African participation and resistance during the time of the slave trades. So, the question for today, round one. Did Africans sell other Africans into slavery? This is a very, very heavy question. We have with us our guest, Brother Myrie, Brother Adam Myrie, who is with the Historical African Martial Arts Association, HAMAA for short. He has written a book, which we have here. The book is Songs of the Sunya. Songs of the Sunya. It is a novel, and it is the first in a series, which he is still developing. But Brother Myrie, he will introduce himself. We also have here a number of references that we will be using as we go along. These are some books that I do recommend, those who have an interest in the subject, if you would like to read further. So our books here, we have this one, The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. Here is another book, Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. This one is a classic. And here is another very important, iconic work. This one is Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams. Eric Williams, he was a scholar out of Trinidad, very well respected, and so there's a lot of good information in this book. For those of you who are joining us from the United States, it is Black History Month there, and this is a very good book for those in the United States to read, myself included. The title is The Half Has Never Been Told: Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism by Edward E. Baptist. This is an excellent book to really get a good understanding on the economic aspect of the slave trade. So those books I just mentioned, those really speak to the side of the discussion which speaks to the exploitation, the process of exploitation which took place during the time of the slave trades. Now, I'm going to just introduce a few books which speak to the other side of the discussion, which is African participation in the slave trade. The first one here, very, very important book. I would definitely recommend this book. It is Transformations in Slavery, A History of Slavery in Africa by Paul E. Lovejoy. The next book here, this book is called Slave Against Slave, Plantation Violence in the Old South by Jeff Foret. Just some examples in which African people in the Americas, were very much taking part in sort of an exploitation against each other. Here is another book that I would like to introduce. This one is called Slave Testimony. And it's basically a collection of speeches, letters, interviews, and autobiographies by persons who were enslaved in the Americas. This also gives some insight into some of the interactions, interpersonal, and even some of those which point to a larger picture of what was taking place during that time. Finally, I will introduce this book here called White Slaves, African Masters, an anthology of American Barbary captivity narratives. This book right here, it's very key to understanding that slavery was not limited to one group of people. It was even something which affected those who we traditionally regard as masters, and those who we traditionally regard as slaves were actually in another position at a different point in time, and at different periods, different places. And so this sort of flips the narrative, if you will, that we are very much accustomed to. So, we are going to take a short break, and when we return, we will get right into the debate. The question again, did Africans sell other Africans into slavery? This is Omri Koch, and you're joining us at Black Researchers United for our first biannual Research Rumble. Stay tuned. We are back from break, and we are just getting ready to get right back into the action. We're getting ready to rumble. And so um, I trust that everyone has had a little time to refresh themselves. We were just setting up our uh, screen here again. I'm just trying to make sure we have everything right. And so we're just going to go ahead and get started. Just give us another minute here. Okay. All right, Brother Myrie, are you ready? Okay. Okay, so once again, for those of you who are just joining us, this is our first biannual research rumble. It is Black History Month here in the United States. And our subject for our rumble, our research debate, is African participation and resistance during the time of the slave trades. So the question that is currently on the table for the first round of this debate, which is today, the question is, did Africans sell other Africans into slavery? That is the question. Did Africans sell other Africans into slavery? So, most of us are familiar with the slave trade. An estimated 12 million people were transported in chains from Africa to the Americas over a period of about 340 years. The transatlantic slave trade, it was a sort of an industry. It basically was more than that, however, because it was a catastrophe. We refer to it today many times as something called a Maafa, and Maafa means disaster in Swahili. And so the transatlantic slave trade, why was it so horrific? It tore mothers and fathers from their children. And it was terrible because so many people lost their lives. And it still has certain effects today, psychological effects, economic effects, we can go on really. And so I think this is very important for us to have this kind of discussion to understand exactly what was taking place during this time, and how can we navigate in the present with this information. So I put together an article on the subject some years ago, and I just recently had this article put up on our website at blackresearchersunited.net. And as I introduced the article, I was reminded of this time when I had spoken to a prince, an African prince, actually a Yoruba prince from Nigeria, who I was taking classes with here in the United States. We were in a class together. It was US history, I believe, to 1877. And in this class, there was a lot of information being shared about the history of the slave trade. However, I spoke to this gentleman sometime after the class was over, and what he shared with me is he believed that based on the history that was shared throughout his family, orally, that the transatlantic slave trade did not happen the way that we learn about it in schools here. According to this prince, he believed that, whenever the history books, the textbooks, and, the professor spoke about the trade as this process in which African people were selling other Africans, he said it didn't happen like that at all. He said instead, what was taking place is that the Europeans came to Africa, to the continent, and took us away in chains, dragged us, screaming to the slave ships, and took us to the Americas. And so this is what he was saying. He said, this is this is my, recollection of his thoughts. He said, just think about it for a second. Imagine how it would have looked to us, a group of Africans, to see someone who is part of our family, a family member, walking with chains on their neck and chains tied around their feet. It would have been very upsetting to us. We would have said, hey, wait, hold on. What's going on here? What is happening? Are you okay? Why do you have these things on you? Who has done this to you? And so he said, if you hear them say that Africans sold other Africans into slavery, don't believe that. It's all a big lie. And so, I decided to undertake some research on this subject. I wanted to figure out, exactly what is the truth. What does the research say? What do what does the source material say? Right? There were a lot of people who lived during this time who shared their experiences, and so I really wanted to get to the bottom of this. What exactly is the truth? Okay, and so that's part of the reason why we're here today, to get some, just to have some discussion on this subject, and to really get some answers. And I hope that those of you who are joining on Facebook, on YouTube, when we're streaming this later, I hope that this also resonates with you, that you get some kind of answers that maybe you're looking for on this subject as well. And so there's a quote, Brother Myrie. It's a quote that's very popular. I'm sure you've heard it as well. A quote by Chinua Achebe, who was a Nigerian author. In his novel, Things Fall Apart, he wrote, "Until the lion learns how to write, every story will glorify the hunter." So what are your thoughts on that, Brother Myrie, as we think about the perspectives that are involved in this story? Understanding, okay, maybe some of the source material is written by persons who were not part of the process of victimization, right? A lot of it was written by people who actually did the enslaving, right? Actually bought and sold human beings, right? So how do we navigate that, Brother Myrie, as we try to understand the actual history of what was taking place?
This is a really good question. And I think I want to start with, we obviously have to consider the biases of the sources that we are reading, but we also have to be able to read through our own biases to see what we can find the facts, especially since many of the people who are writing on these issues had access to original source material. So they had access to ship's logs from the European traders who showed up on the Gold Coast. And they said who they bought their slaves from, right? We also have to consider the way that the story is being told. Because the transatlantic slave trade is such a colossal crime against humanity, there is significant investment in divesting one's self. When I say divesting oneself, I don't mean the person or the individual, but I mean the society and the culture from the genesis of that. You often hear this used as a talking point for people who want to be apologists for what happened to Black people in the Americas, saying, "Oh well, Africans sold their own people. They don't know what they don't know how to protect themselves. Europeans know how to protect themselves," forgetting that Europeans were slaughtering each other en masse during World War I and World War II.
Mm.
right? Or during the Napoleonic Wars, or insert any number of wars that happened in Europe over the last 500 years.
True.
So the other problem is that the question itself is oversimplified.
Mm.
So when we say, did Africans sell other Africans into slavery? I mean, if you look at it on its face, if a European slave trader shows up on the coast of West Africa and
Mm-hmm.
he provides firearms, gunpowder, gold, well, not gold because they had tons of it in West Africa, but other materials to a person who is African, who in response provides him with slaves, that is an African person being involved in the slave trade,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's no way to get around that. But when you
And
oversimplify
and
the
that's
narrative,
whether or not they were coerced, right?
well, and that's the other question, because if you look at kingdoms like the Dahomey, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Dahomey during the period of colonization and slavery, so between the 1500s and the early 18th century,
Mm-hmm.
they expanded significantly during that period. And much of their expansion was due to the acquisition of firearms from Europeans.
Mm.
And how they got those firearms was by providing prisoners of war to Europeans in exchange for those weapons. So
Right.
it's not to say that they were coerced. Maybe the situation that they were in required them to get access to these firearms, and this was the
Mm.
fastest way to do it,
Right.
right? But nobody was literally this wasn't a situation like between the kingdoms of Makuria and the Abbasid and the Rashidun Caliphate, where the Rashidun says, provide us with 300 slaves every year or we'll invade you, right?
Mm.
That isn't what happened with the west coast of Africa, not at least until the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to consider that, but we also have to take a look at the biases of the people who are writing it and compare it to what physical evidence is there. Because that's the other problem when we look at studying history. People
Mm-hmm.
like to craft narratives, but the narratives always have to be held up against what the narratives always have to be held up against what the physical evidence says. So
Right.
you could, for example, all of the written accounts of the Battle of Isandlwana, to go to something outside of the slave trade, are written down by Europeans. So we have a very biased European perspective. We have Lord Chelmsford writing very dismissively about the Zulus before he goes to invade. But then when you look at how everything bore out and compare to what he said, you can determine what he said to make himself look good versus what actually happened in that situation, right?
Right. Right.
So that, in my view, is what's important to say. So I'll tie this off because I don't want to monopolize the whole conversation. But in short, yes, we
Mm-hmm.
have to consider who is telling the story, but we also have to look at the physical evidence and what other sources say. If multiple sources are saying roughly the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
then we should probably consider the fact that that might be the case. But we also have to remember that there is always nuance connected to that. It's never exactly very simple.
Right. Yeah, I certainly agree. I believe that that we have to be careful about the sources that we're pulling from and the sources we're really reading on this subject. But also, like you said, if multiple sources are saying the same thing, then hey, that could be a clue that what's being described, there's some validity there, right? There's a saying that where there's smoke, there's fire.
Exactly.
Um, not to say that's always the case, but I think it's very important for us to consider. Another thing too, Brother Myrie, is that sometimes one source is quoting another, and that's the reason why you have multiple sources saying the same thing. So we got to be careful of that as well.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. And that's why we have to compare it to the physical evidence.
Yes. So, when I think about the evidence, right, what physical evidence might there be today on this subject? Because there's, clearly, even when it comes to the evidence of the Middle Passage, how many slave ships, how many, archaeological, findings are there that deal with the slave ships? Just recently they've discovered the Clotilda slave ship, the remains, but that's just one of very few. I think maybe there's just a handful of them. So where can we turn for that physical evidence?
Well, there's a lot of places. So if we want to look at physical evidence, these are the types of things we're looking for. We are looking for buildings or infrastructure. We are looking for records. We can look at DNA evidence. We can look at linguistic evidence. We can look at economic evidence. So, for example, money. So we know, for example, that we have slave castles in West Africa. That's already our first indicator that the slave trade happened. The second is that we have records from Africans themselves about the wars that they were fighting at that time. You have, for example, some villages from the period that had built their huts in a special way to protect themselves from slave traders. They would sort of make the adobe houses, but make them extra thick so that small firearms couldn't get through them. And then there'd be a small door that they could crawl in under the bottom. And so if somebody was trying to crawl into their hut under the bottom, they could attack that person before they get in. That's an example of people who are self-protecting. And then we can look at manifestos. I've actually physically held in my hands a record from a ship that had a list of all of the slaves that they had purchased from a dealer in Cuba. I think it was Cuba. And you have the names, the condition, determining whether the person was born in Africa or born in the West Indies, and then that will tell you that's another indicator of the trade. Another indication as well as we can look at what the histories that aren't directly connected to the coast will say. So if you look at the history of the Kingdom of Zaria or Zozo, depending on how you want to call it, while for the most of their history they were not a coastal kingdom, the slave trade was a major part of their economy because they were selling slaves north to the North Africans. And then as they expanded closer to the coast, it is on record that is what they would do after a battle. All of these prisoners of war, they had to go somewhere. They weren't going to reintegrate them into their society. So they had to either imprison them, kill them, or sell them. And it made more sense for them to sell them so that they could get firearms, horses, and other materials so they could continue their campaigns of expansion. So these are all the different types of evidence outside of essays and books that we can look at to give us a picture of what was going on at the time.
Yes. I love that you mentioned those structures, those physical structures that were built. In some places on the continent of Africa today, you can still see the walls that were constructed, by these different communities to protect themselves, right, from their neighbors, from different conquering kingdoms and empires that were expanding during that time. And so I definitely believe the evidence is there. We just have to be diligent, in doing the research that's going to, to unearth these very historic documents and structures again, and the literature that's available. It's important also to recognize, I think, that even besides the physical evidence, there is, of course, the evidence that is oral, right? A lot of the histories of Africa were preserved through that oral tradition. And so there are a number of books, I think, which are very instrumental in, helping us to understand some of that heritage that has been preserved over time. There's an excellent scholar out of Howard University, Ana Lucia Araujo. I hope I'm saying her name correctly. She's written a number of books on basically her experiences talking with people who were descended from enslaved people, talking with people who were descended from the enslavers as well. So she's basically gone to Africa, she's gone to Benin, to Angola, she's gone to places in the diaspora, places like Brazil, and she's had conversations with persons who've told her, hey, my great grandfather was a slave trader, and people who've said, hey, my grandmother, she had told me about some of those experiences during that time. And I think that's something that cannot be ignored.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So, so as we continue, there's another question that comes to my mind, which is, what was happening in Africa during the time of the slave trades? So, again, I pointed out there's a book here, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. The implication within that title is that an underdevelopment took place, meaning that there was a point where Africa was up here before the slave trade, before colonization, and then afterwards, Africa was down here, or at a lower position in terms of development, right? And as a matter of fact, I have another book here. This book right here, The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. This book really goes into that, how Africa was at, a very high state of development, of civilization, before their encounter with Europeans, with outside communities, Arabs as well, and how these processes, through the slave trades, through war, through colonization, really changed that dynamic. So yeah, I think that's definitely something that needs to be a part of the discussion. So, Brother Myrie, what would you say to that? How, based on your research, how do you analyze that question? Where was Africa before the slave trade, and what was happening in Africa during the time of the slave trades, which basically enabled this process to take place?
Well, I think the first thing we have to understand is that a slave trade existed in various parts of Africa in various different incarnations at various periods in time. For example, the slave trade into the Middle East is thousands of years old, going all the way back to at least the 7th century or even earlier than that. So, we do have to consider that as well. Mind you, that particular slave trade wasn't race-based, it was religion-based, and that's a whole different thing to look at. But if we're looking at the decline of African civilizations, this is how I would explain it. Europe, prior to its expansion into the Americas, because now we're talking about a global economy, we're looking at an area that was basically consuming a lot of products from outside of Europe. So we're talking about spices. There was a point during the 15th century when almost 2/3 of the gold circulating in the European market came from Mali's mines. We're talking about the early trade in arquebuses, in the early 1500s, and the Moroccans, I believe, brought that into West Africa when they had tried to invade Mali. We are looking at an extensive trans-Saharan trade network. We're looking at relationships between East African kingdoms and empires as far as China. So this is what we're looking at, this economic powerhouse. But herein lies the problem. A lot of the wealth that I'm going to say mostly West African kingdoms had acquired had a lot to do with trade, not directly, but indirectly with Europe. When Europe arrived in the Americas, they no longer had a need for goods from Africa. Needed, because now they're able to exploit the indigenous people and acquire silver, gold, send ships full of silver and gold back to Spain, for example, who now, because of expelling all of the Moors, no longer had a trade conduit through the Muslim world, and the prices were high. And so now, where once 2/3 of the gold in your mines was flooding the European market, now you have all of this gold and nobody's buying.
Right.
So that is going to cause things like inflation, because now you have all this extra gold sitting there. You're going to now your kingdom is weaker. So now another kingdom that maybe trades in other items that are in demand in North Africa and in Europe will now expand. So they will look to take your land. And now you have to find a way to get into that competition. So, Africa at the time of colonization and the earlier to the mid part of the slave trade up until it sort of reached a fever pitch, was in a serious period of transition. I mean, as soon as the taps sort of got cut off to the European market, and there was no more of a conduit. I mean, they were still obviously selling to the Turks and selling to parts of Asia, but West Africa specifically was too physically far and had too many intermediaries between, say Timbuktu and the trade ports of the Adjaran Empire, right? And so that is sort of how I would explain it. That was what was happening in West Africa. So the first step to being underdeveloped was the fact that their key foreign market was no longer interested in their goods. Then now your key foreign market now is interested in a particular good that you have, but that good is now human capital. And so now, these kingdoms that were fighting because resources were getting scarce now have all of these prisoners of war. And jails were not a major thing that you had in West Africa. Once you fight a war and you win that battle, either they accept you as the ruler, or you sell them off in slavery, or you have to execute them, right?
You're referring to African society or European society?
African society specifically.
Okay.
In Europe, they had prisons and they executed people. That's what they did in Europe. Or they press ganged people into sending them to the colonies in order to basically get some work out of their labor, get some labor out of it. And we can talk about penal colonies later, but in West Africa specifically, because it's hard to say all of Africa is the same, because the trade markets in Eastern Africa were very lucrative, people were making a lot of money, and they were not too concerned with competing with Europeans or trying to sell to them because they had a whole other market on the other side of the world. But in West Africa specifically, the trade goods that you had were no longer interesting to your former market. Now it's human capital, because they need to use labor to build up these colonies. And then what ended up happening is, as the Europeans were made wealthier through their colonies in the Americas, their ability to have professional specialization, develop innovations, and all these other things to solve the problems of trying to build or build a copy of their society on the other side of the world led to technological advancements, which then gave them the power to, and then of course wars with other European powers ended up providing them with the opportunity to circle back and now invade these places or use gunboat diplomacy in order to get things done. Mind you, that wasn't fully possible until the later part of the 19th century, because while people were still using muskets, the African empires were still kind of toe-to-toe with their European counterparts in terms of being able to handle them on the battlefield. But once you enter in, cartridge rounds and Maxim guns, and the populations of Europeans in their colonies have basically exploded, you can sort of see where this is going to go.
Yeah, I would say that definitely, that definitely resonates with my research as well. I've definitely found that, like Walter Rodney points out in his book, Africa was at a state of civilization which was very advanced. A lot of for example, like if you look at the kingdoms in West Africa, Hakim Adi, who was a scholar from the UK, he has pointed out that, they were much larger than what you would have found in Western Europe during this very same time. There was a lot of wealth in these kingdoms. You talk about Ghana, Mali, Songhay, right? These are the empires that we're discussing here. And of course, if you look at the continent today, these would have stretched across several states, what are states now currently existing. And so that's something that we definitely have to bear in mind, that there was a sort of a transformation, right? There's certain European scholars who are of the opinion that Africa, was not in any way developed during that time, and the slave trade didn't actually have any kind of effect, or even had a very minimal effect, if any at all. But I think that's something that the research certainly suggests otherwise. When you think about the number of people that were taken, right? How certain parts of the continent were literally just depleted, of manpower. And with that comes, who's going to build the nation, right? Who is going to help to consolidate those empires which were devastated through war. And so I definitely believe there was a certain process that was taking place which underdeveloped the continent. Um, and that's the way I would address that question of what was taking place in Africa during the slave trades. Um, there was something very interesting that I came across in my research, which was the story of um, a revolution which was taking place in Congo, in Central Africa. Now, this is not the same Congo we find there today. It was the Kingdom of Congo. Um, and so Congo was basically, they were going through some internal conflicts. There was a province of Congo called Sanho, also known as Soyo, and there was a duke there, which the Portuguese refer to him as a duke. I prefer to use the term governor. It's just what I'm more familiar with. But essentially, the governor in Sanho basically rose against Congo, the Kingdom of Congo, the King of Congo, and was saying, we are our own people. We deserve to have our own state. We deserve to, to create our own rules, our own society. And so there was this internal conflict taking place, in which either side had decided that, this is the course that we're going to take. And with Sanho was actually, they were gaining power. They were expanding. They were taking all these, territories from the Kingdom of Congo. It got to a point where the King of Congo decided, hey, we have to do something about this. And so that was one of the situations which led to certain trade alliances, particularly with, in the case of Sanho, with the Dutch, I believe it was, and with Congo, the Portuguese. I might be mixing that a little bit, but essentially,
I think you're right. I think you're right, because the Kingdom of Congo had an alliance with Portugal.
Right. Now I'm not sure if it was during this time specifically, but I just wanted to share that just to illustrate an example of some of the politics that was, very much present within the continent of Africa during this time. A lot of times we think about Africa as this kind of a monolith, like, this place where all of these people are living and at peace with one another, prior to the arrival of the Europeans. We don't really think about Africa as a place where people have problems with each other, right? Like literally anywhere else at any other time period in human history. Of course, they had their own ways of settling those problems, which are very different from what we do today. But I think it's important for us to recognize that, in this situation, it really was to the detriment of, I would say, both of these two communities, because the story of Congo, based on my research, they were very much devastated by the relationship that was established with these European traders, and it's not just a situation of independent traders. It was actually also a very diplomatic relationship. So you're talking about the Kingdom of Congo and the Kingdom of Portugal, right? For example, and so I'm trying to see if I can get a quote here. Exactly what was happening. So there was a writer named John Ogilvy. There was a writer named John Ogilvy, a Scottish writer. He wrote a book called America, and the subtitle is very long. I will not read it. But basically it's something about, this book was supposed to be an accurate description of the New World, the different empires of the indigenous people in Mexico, Peru, etc. But also there's a point in the book which talks about the plantations that existed, which the Europeans rather had established, not that they were previously existing, right? And so John Ogilvy gets into how did these plantations come about? how did they supply these plantations with people who were basically doing the labor? And so he actually mentions this story that I referenced about Congo and Sanho. He says essentially what took place, the governor of Brazil, John Maurice, he was in charge of again, the colony of Brazil, which at that time was under the Dutch. Okay. So what's interesting is there was an embassy which arrived in Brazil from the Kingdom of Congo. And the ambassadors, they requested of the Dutch, so this would be the Dutch governor, John Maurice, they requested of him to help them in their war, in their civil war against Sanho. And in order to kind of in order to help to secure this assistance, they brought a gift for the governor. And this gift was basically captive Africans. They were prisoners, right? This is something we have to understand. They were not, it's not like they were selling people from Congo, from the kingdom, people who were on the same side as the king, right? That's not the case of what was taking place here. These were captives that were consisted of different communities which lived in the surrounding area, persons that were also maybe criminals, persons who were condemned, so that's something that we have to understand. But now John Oldreby also notes that after these ambassadors from Congo left, there were agents, he says, he calls them agents, from Sanho, who came again to John Maurice and asked and basically told him, do not help the people of Congo. Do not help the king of Congo, because according to them, he was corrupt. And, we want a revolution. We're trying to establish our own kingdom, our own society. And so, again, what they did in order to help to secure this, they also brought prisoners. They also brought captives. So Brother Myrie, what are your thoughts on that? How this kind of politics that was taking place during this time period, what were some of the reasons why African people might have gotten involved in the trade, or might not?
Well, I mean, we also have to remember, for us, hindsight is 2020, right? Mm-hmm. It's almost like, we are reading the narratives of these histories with a bit of dramatic irony. It's almost like, don't go in that room, the killer is behind the door. So that's how we're reading it now. But if you look at it from the perspective of the people at that time, gifting slaves was a normal practice, right? You make friends with the king of another kingdom. Here's some gold. Here's some fine linens or some fine bark cloth. Here are some swords. Oh, by the way, here are a couple of slaves. Take them; they will serve you well, right? And we have to remember that this is not exclusive to Africa. This is places all over the world were doing this. So while I don't want to say, well, they were doing it too as a way to excuse it, I want to explain that this was a common practice around the world in feudalistic, monarchical societies of those days. Mm-hmm. So imagine you're a king and you have this upstart governor who has started this devastating civil war, and it looks like he might win. Mm-hmm. Then you have these foreign traders who have absolutely no familial, no economic, no political ties to that person. Because if all of your allies are local, you have to worry about, well, this person might have a cousin's brother's nephew who is related to the governor that is revolting, right? You see this happening all the time in medieval European politics. I mean, even in World War I, the King of England, Chancellor of Germany, and the Tsar of Russia were all cousins.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So
There was
you
definitely
have
some
to kind of
relation
think
there.
that you're having this internal conflict. You
Mhm.
need somebody from outside who just happens to have access to the firearms technology that you need to get an advantage on this other guy. And as a king, you want to look worldly. Look at me. I have associations outside of this, outside of the region of this kingdom, who can bring in all of these great tools to help make our people strong.
Mm.
Right? Not
Mhm.
there was no way for him to know that the Europeans had ulterior motives when they were trading in his country. There was no way for him to know that. I mean,
Right.
yes, true, it is on him to know how to make the deals that will improve his people, right? I mean, he could have gone the route of Madagascar by kidnapping a cannon maker and forcing his people to learn forcing him to teach his people how to make gunpowder. He could have done that, but it was much easier to just buy the guns, right? Especially if they weren't going to tell you how to make the gunpowder or how to make the barrels or how to do any of that.
Right.
So,
Right.
in my view of it, the king was just doing what any normal king would have done
Yes.
when faced with an internal threat that he is in real danger of losing to. You go
Hmm.
to a pinch hitter, you hire some mercenaries, or you buy some muskets, and then you take that to the field, and then worry about dealing with these things later. Emperor Menelik II did that just before the First Italo-Ethiopian War. He was dealing
Hmm.
with a lot of conflict internally, and it looked like he might not win. He calls up the Italians. The Italians say, "Sure, I'll sell you some guns. Just give us Eritrea." I mean, if you have a choice between losing your crown and possibly your head, and a strip of land you really don't care that much about, what are you going to do?
Hmm.
Right? So we have to consider that too. Like, it's really important that, just as a general perspective, that we look at these people as people with very real problems and very high stakes for the
Right.
decisions that they're making. I'm sure
Right.
in hindsight, if he knew that the Dutch were going to, or the Portuguese were going to, uh, turn the tables on him
Mhm.
and start taking people without permission and all these other things, he probably wouldn't have dealt with them.
Which is
But the
which is
fact of the
exactly what
matter,
happened.
right? But
Yeah.
there was no way for him to know that. For all
Hmm.
he knew, these people who showed up from other part of the world he's never heard of, they
Hmm.
honored their trade deals. They paid him fair prices for his goods.
Right.
They bought the slaves and gave him the guns, and everything. He had no reason to think that they were going to lie or steal from him.
Hmm.
And lo and behold,
Yeah. Yeah. That is, that's the picture that I get as well. My understanding is that there were certain rivalries that were existing on the continent before contact with the Europeans. And I feel
absolutely.
that, based on my research, the Europeans basically helped to kind of accentuate those rivalries, to solidify them, if you will, and exacerbate them. Um, it was, I think of it this way: if you had a choice, if you had a choice, I mean, these people in your kingdom were pestering you all these years, and here's an opportunity to basically get rid of them once and for all. How many of us would jump at that opportunity? Um, it's something to think about.
Exactly. And the thing is, you see this all throughout history. The best example of this is the rise of the first Islamic Caliphate.
Mhm.
What people don't understand is when they look at this, they just think, oh, this army from the middle of the desert just sort of expanded and took all this land.
Mhm.
Backtrack a couple of years before that expansion started. You have a series of massive, destructive, and very expensive wars between the Byzantines and the Sassanids. By the time the Islamic Caliphate started to rise, the Byzantines and the Sassanids did not have the manpower or the
Mhm.
money to be able to fight this whole new force of soldiers. Their
Right.
armies were depleted. They had no money, and they basically wore each other out, and that's what ended up happening in Africa. These two
Mhm.
kingdoms, who, if combined and more, what's the word I want to use, were more unified and had a singular purpose, would have
Mhm.
provided a much bigger obstacle to the arrival of Europeans when they showed up and they wanted to take land and people, etc. But
Right.
they were fighting each other because that's what civilizations do.
That's right. That's what civilizations do. That's what, empires do. All throughout history, we can see examples of this. So a question I want to ask is, um, we understand, I would say, why the process of enslavement happened, right? Um, and I would I would say as well, we understand, um, based on, again, hindsight, we understand why African people were not really united. They didn't necessarily think of themselves as, hey, we're all Africans, right? Or hey, we're all Black people, and here are some white people, and they're coming to take what's ours. No, it wasn't that kind of a situation. They were very much, individual communities that were living on the same, landmass, but they had their own cultures, they had their own belief systems, they had their own, uh, cosmology, their understanding of the universe and their place in it. They had so many things that were different, even though today we can look at them and say, hey, there are some similarities, right? We can map those similarities, whether it's through culture, again, whether it's through spirituality, whether it's through language, right? If it's genetic as well. Yeah, I mean, we can see that today, but in this time period, that was simply just not the case. And my question, Brother Myrie, is, did African people have an understanding of what was taking place? Well, just how what was the extent of that understanding? Based on your research, um, because what I found, what I found, like reading, for example, the autobiography of Equiano, who basically was an Igbo, from what is now Nigeria. Um, he tells it like it is, right? One of the things he points out in his book is that, hey, I was kidnapped by African people. It was Black people who did this to me. It wasn't white people. They literally, it was him and his sister who were out together, and at one point he was describing how sometimes African children would climb trees, and they would look out to see if there were any invaders coming to the village. And that was basically what they were doing when they were captured. And he says, he acknowledges that this is what took place. And there were several other narratives that I read which basically alluded to the same thing. For example, again from the UK, there is the narrative of Ignatius Santro. He basically also said something very similar. And here's what he said. It's a quote. He said, "In Africa, the poor wretched natives blessed with the most fertile and luxuriant soil are rendered so much the more miserable for what Providence has meant to be a blessing," referring to commerce. The Christians, and Christians he's using as a blanket term for Europeans, abominable traffic for slaves, and the horrid cruelty and treachery of the petty kings encouraged by their Christian customers, who carry them strong liquors to inflame their national madness, and powder and bad firearms to furnish them with the hellish means of killing and kidnapping. So he's saying, essentially that, yes, African people, they participated in the trade. And matter of fact, he refers to petty kings, so almost like, corruption in a way, like, the leaders who were participating. But he also acknowledges the role that Europeans played in that process, right? Bringing, for example, alcohol, right? Brandy. That was one of the things that they traded with, to the African people. And according to Ignatius Santro, that was one of the things that enabled this process to take place. So yeah, my question, Brother Myrie, is, didn't African people see what was taking place? you know, I would imagine that, first of all, we understand before Africans were transported to the Americas, right there on the coast, they were branded, right, with the company symbols. The West India Company, you know, the British Africa Company, right? Um, these are these are the realities, and so I can imagine some of the communities close to the coast would have heard the screaming, the crying, the moaning, the wailing, would have seen persons being dragged away in chains, and shackles. Um, some people who they knew, right? Um, so what was their level of awareness, Brother Myrie?
So, how do I put this? Well, I'll start with a question. Mm-hmm. Do you know whether or not the shirt that you are wearing was made in a sweatshop?
That's a good question. I believe this one, I think it was made in Kenya, but I do not.
You don't know, right? Mm-hmm. Now imagine we have access to telecommunications, the internet. Somebody could call you from Nairobi and tell you, or you could call the owner of the company in Nairobi and find out who was making your shirt. Mm-hmm. They couldn't do that back then, right? And you have to remember that slavery existed already. The Hausa were among some of the most brutal slave owners before the Europeans showed up. The practice of branding.
By the way, when you say slave owners, is it just a particular class of people within their society? So was it just the kings? The Hausa, I'm not familiar with the particular political structure of their society, whether they had kings.
So they had a king, they had a sultan.
Okay.
So they had a sultan. Mm-hmm. And so some of the major parts of their trade networks in the 1500s included slaves, textiles, pottery work, and there was something else, but I cannot remember. It may have been weapons, but they may have gotten through one of their trade relationships on the coast. Mm-hmm. But essentially, slavery was a major part. Branding was not something new. And you also have to remember that they may not see people that they know brought in chains. The trip to the coast for some people was 3 months long. That's a long walk.
Yeah.
So you might see people being gathered up and all you can think about is the slave the slave market in Zozo. Mm-hmm. Or you're thinking about the slave markets where the Tuareg would pick up people to carry them north. So in that respect, the population, in my view at least, would have already been to a point desensitized to the idea of people being chained, branded, and sold. Mm-hmm. Because too, remember that they viewed a lot of these people as criminals, the same way that you see chain gangs, working in the United States. Mind you, they don't get branded, but that person in other cultures, criminals get branded for life. Right? So you're seeing somebody branded and in chains, they must have committed a terrible crime, because that is how people end up as a slave. Mm-hmm. Or maybe they owed somebody a lot of money, and that is how you end up as a slave. Right. Also remember that slavery was not hereditary. Right?
In African society.
In most African societies, I say most because you can't have absolutes. There are exceptions. Slavery, for the most part, was not hereditary, and it was very common for people to be released from their bondage during their lifetime. Mm-hmm. So you see people on the coast, and they're gone. And you think about people who are trying to get rid of their political rivals. This happened to my ancestor. One of my ancestors, according to the oral history from my grandfather, was a petty king in West Africa, and his whole compound was raided by, I'm assuming, a rival. And him and his whole family ended up getting shipped over to the West Indies as slaves. But if you consider the fact that the journey is like a month long from where they were to where the coast is, nobody where they ended up just before they got sold off would know who they were.
Right.
They might not even speak their language. So unless somebody got on a boat from the Americas, and went back to Africa and said, hey, this is what they're doing to us over here. There's no real way for them to know beyond things that they have already seen.
Mm-hmm.
And then also considering that these are other people. In fact, one of the common myths I hear from West Africans who have, shall I say, less than favorable opinions of people in the diaspora is that, oh, they're the descendants of the criminals we didn't want. Right? And
Yeah.
this isn't obviously to point a finger at Africans and say you're terrible people, but this is one of the things that you hear often, right? Which is why you end up with a rift between this is how you end up with the diaspora wars.
To that point, Brother Myrie, I was reading the book Fighting the Slave Trade by Sylviane Diouf, who is a Senegalese historian. And one point she brings out on that is, there's two sides of it, right? There's, first of all, there's the side which people have this notion, this idea that African people, by the way, I mean African people on the continent at this time were in a sort of a privileged position, in that they kind of carried on and they didn't necessarily have any kind of, the slave trade did not impact them in a sort of way, except the people who were taken and sold off, right? And then there's people, the other side is that people in the diaspora, people on the continent, like you said, right, who have this idea that, oh, the people were just criminals and, the worst of the worst, right? But actually what Dr. Diouf points out is that the reality is people who were participating in the trade as traders, as merchants, as even people who were connected to the royal families who were engaged in the trade were also sold in the trade. So that adds a layer to this. And then there's the fact that even people on the continent who were left on the continent, basically they had relatives that were sold in the trade. So they suffered loss too. The people in the continent, people in diaspora also suffered loss, but also some of those same people who were shipped off into the diaspora were themselves participants in the trade, right? Were themselves slave traders. So that's why I'm saying there's two sides to it.
Well, I think you bring up a very important point, and I think that obviously we have to consider nuance, right? It's not an absolute. But I would argue that your point still standing, that for the most part, the people who ended up at the coast had no relation to the people who were living there and benefiting from the trade, because those guns were going to somebody.
True.
Right?
True.
And also, we can consider things like mercenaries and all of these other things too, right? Because there are religious components. A lot of the traders who worked for the Europeans were Muslims, and they, that in there is a part in the I have to remember the exact ayat, but it basically refers to being able to enslave people who are not people of the book, right? A freeborn Muslim cannot be a slave.
Right.
And so there's that religious difference as well, which you see bearing out in places like the Ottoman Empire, where they would enslave Christians and animists and other groups of people. So I would argue that, yes, you are absolutely right, that people who themselves were engaging in the trade ended up getting sold off. And usually when you deal with things like human trafficking, you're not going to be dealing with people who are very concerned about morals and loyalty beyond the dollar. So if somebody wanted to take, say you and I were working on the trade together and you crossed me, you know what I mean? All I'd have to do is find a way to get you in the slave pen.
Yes.
I lock the door, and then nobody ever hears from you again. Right?
And that's exactly what happened, Brother Myrie. I'm telling you, I've read stories of this, and I'm not talking about Europeans writing or sharing these stories. African people,
right.
This is the reality of what was taking place during this time. There was one story in which, the story basically went that there was a Moor who was selling, a captive African into slavery. And when he was done with the sale, he was basically, you know, taken onto the very same ship, put in the same shackles, and he was placed down to sit right beside the very same person who he had sold. I think the person he had sold, maybe it could have been a week prior, because the ships didn't leave right away. Sometimes they stayed there for a few months until they were packed.
And all that other stuff.
Right. And so I thought that was very interesting. Another thing too, I'm trying, it just escaped me. It'll come back to me.
But the point still stands. You're dealing with an industry that isn't exactly known for its morals. And so it is very easy for somebody, especially when the people who are buying the slaves do not care where these people came from.
Yes.
If they were criminals, if they weren't criminals, they did not care. These human beings were not human beings to the people who were buying and taking them across the water. So you might be selling them a slave, and then they just decide, you know what, we'll take you too. Clink, clink. Then we don't have to pay you.
That's right. And those who had like these trade deals and they didn't fulfill their end of the deal. For example, there were certain tributes that had to be sent every year. So there was a quota of, we need like a certain amount of captives from you. Yeah. And if you cannot deliver on that quota, then hey, join the line, right?
Exactly. And the point how you got rid of rival royals as well.
Yes.
If I'm trying to take the throne, take the throne, and I don't want to be pegged for assassinating the king, it is very easy for me to pay 10 dudes to sneak into his bedroom at night, grab him, and then take him to the coast and have him hurried off to a ship that's leaving tomorrow.
Exactly. There were literally certain, we can call them coups, really, is what they were, where there were certain persons who were jealous and said, hey, I want the throne for myself. And they had the royal person who was basically next in line shipped off, as if they were a common person, as one of the prisoners or the other people who were taken as slaves. And the point I wanted to bring up before that I lost was basically that there were certain times when, for example, those couples that you're referring to, Brother Myrie, that crossed the continent, there were times when those captives got the better of their captors and sold them into slavery. These are things that happen.
Well, exactly. And I mean, and this goes through the whole continent. I mean, the Azande were one group, however, that did know what was going on or had a fairly knowledgeable understanding. They were a group from Central East Africa. So they would be more like Southern Sudan and then the sort of the eastern part of Congo. And they revolted in terms of they were known for breaking up caravans of slave traders. So they would see people trading slaves, they would hunt them down and unalive everybody and cut off body parts and send them back to the slave traders' camp saying, stay out of our land or we will dismember you again. So, I mean, there is nuance. There are some people who had no idea what was going on and other people who did know what was going on. And the people who did know what was going on did something about it. And the people who didn't to just operate as they would, right? Not content. Because the thing is, too, you're not, a lot of these kingdoms were not running a census to determine what the population loss is. It's just one day you notice that half the people in the market are gone, right? Whole villages are empty. And you end up finding that out a bit later on. You haven't heard from your cousin in a month, but that's not abnormal because you live in very far apart villages. You go to visit and everything is dilapidated and empty. So, I mean, I think that Africans overall, and when I say Africans, I'm referring to the various kingdoms, not a unified body.
Right.
We're not fully aware of what was happening until it was too late. And what I mean too late is when the gap in technology and human capital had gotten so far that they were no longer able to resist military incursions from Europeans. That is the 19th century and the scramble for Africa.
Right. So, when as you mentioned that, Brother Myrie, they had no idea. my question to that is, what about the African people who returned to the continent from in the diaspora? There were times when, for example, my research on like the slave rebellions and the revolts that took place, there were times when the persons who had participated in the revolts, they were sent back to the continent as a sort of punishment. Now, in those cases, my understanding is that they were actually sent to certain penal colonies, or certain, places where they were confined. But also, there were times when people were set free. For example, you talk about the Amistad Rebellion.
Yeah.
The result of that at the end was that they won the trial. They were returned to the continent. I believe it was something like 80 something of them. And that happened at different points in history. There's a book about this called Recaptured Africans. I think it was by Charles Fett. And the whole book talks about when the British were traveling the coasts of Africa, and they were, after the slave trade was abolished, the actual trade, over,
Right. Trafficking, yes.
right, the traffic across the Atlantic, they would raid these ships. They would basically rescue the persons on board who were held in chains and take them back to the continent, and sometimes drop them off in just random places. But still, what about those incidents, Brother Myrie? What can you say to that in terms of, the, again, African people had no idea. And again, that story that I referenced earlier about Congo, they literally sent ambassadors to the Americas, and those ambassadors returned to the kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, could they not see the condition of the African people who were in these colonies?
So there are two things I will say about that. The first thing I'll say about that is, just to refer to my previous point, those who did know better did better. You have the example of Queen Zinga, who fought against the Portuguese and did not want to give them any slaves, right? So
Right.
we do have examples.
Even though she, she actually did participate as well.
She participated, she did, but there was a certain point when she was like, okay, they are violating the terms of our agreement, and they're taking slaves without my permission, and now it stops today, right? It was more of a political, we're not trading with you kind of a situation, but she got the sense that the Portuguese were taking advantage of the position that they were in, and she put a stop to it. And so it's not that she had some great moral epiphany about the way that slaves were being treated, but it was part and parcel of the whole package. And this also goes back to my other point about they were already desensitized to people working as slaves.
Right.
To be honest, I'm not completely familiar with the full extent of those ambassadors' visit to the Americas. So I don't know if they had an opportunity to learn how the chattel slavery system worked. But seeing people who are
there's no information really
right.
On the record as far as that goes. All that we know is they traveled to the Americas, and particularly in this case to Brazil. Not only that, they also traveled to Europe. They traveled to Portugal. Right. I mean, if you talk about even Abyssinia, or the Kingdom of Ethiopia, as it was known during that time, you had ambassadors from there who traveled to places like Italy, to Rome, to the Vatican.
Right.
So there was certainly an element of travel and trade and sort of exchange of knowledge to some extent.
And so this goes back to my point of seeing people who are enslaved be chained up and working is not something that they are unfamiliar with. But the depths of the system may be something they just didn't know, right? Ethiopia practiced slavery, was probably one of the last countries. I think Mauritania was the last country to ban slavery in the 1980s, right? So, I mean, to say that they would see the enslaved people and then all of a sudden feel all of this compassion, you have to remember, one, they're looking at people who they do not view as their own. And then you have to consider that they're used to seeing people enslaved, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's people who manage to come back and explain the system, like Brother Equiano, who, later became an abolitionist. Or, you have Sinke from the Amistad. When he got back home, his whole village was burned down. So there was nobody waiting for him to hear his story. Right? So it's sort of the big picture. So there are people who did talk, and then other people who just wanted to get on with their lives, right? And they would tell other people. But if you and me are average Joes, I mean, you know what? I'll give the perfect example of what is happening today. There are open slave markets happening in Libya right now. Right now, today, as you and I are talking, there are Black people being sold to slavery for $500 in Libya. You know what's going on. I know what's going on. Our government knows what's going on. But how much energy is actually being put into ending the slave trade? Right?
That's a good question.
This isn't to say that we are terrible people and we have no moral compass and we don't have a heart. But the fact of the matter is, what can you do as an average person?
True. And then also, even with the power of governments, because in Africa now, we have a situation where African nations have militaries, right?
Yes.
The capacity of those militaries is another story. But still, if they were able to form certain alliances, if they said, okay, let's come together, let's form some kind of a, let's just let's bond together and basically bring some pressure on the Libyan government, and to see if we can do something about the situation. So it's like even today, we can look at it in that light and say, hey, there is a potential to do something, but maybe these nations, for some reason or another, have some other priorities. Maybe they have their own problems going on in their own countries, people being exploited, and they're struggling to address those problems.
Well, think about the geopolitics of the situation, though, right? A lot of people have believe in a lot of different reasons that Libya was invaded. But consider the history of Western governments in African countries who wanted to express and exercise independence and autonomy, apart from those European powers. France will invade a country. Suddenly there'll be a coup, and the president will suddenly lose their head or be exiled. You end up with a manufactured civil war, like what happened in Libya. This isn't to say, and I don't want to discredit the Libyan people who actually did want freedom from Gaddafi's regime. But I find it very interesting that Western powers were so interested in funding, in funding and flying missions. My country, Canada, we flew 720 missions, bombing the Libyan army during the war.
Wow.
What business do we have in Libya? Right?
Yeah,
aside from the fact
the incentive?
Aside from the fact that Gaddafi wanted to have a gold-backed currency for trade, right? And he wanted more economic independence for his African neighbors,
which would have been a threat to the established system.
Exactly. Now consider now that
the power dynamic between Europe and Africa.
Exactly. And that power dynamic right now, and this is getting a bit off topic, but I promise I'll get back to the main subject after I finish this point. Consider now China is going into many of these African countries, offering loans and helping people and helping them develop their countries, which is something Western nations did not do, right? I always like to give the example of Britain giving Jamaica 25 million pounds, not for roads, not for hospitals, but to build a bigger prison, so that they could ship their deportees to Jamaica.
And after they had been requesting reparations, that was essentially their response.
Well, exactly. And then of course you have the deportation of the Windward generation, right? Which is all the Caribbean people that went into the UK to rebuild the country after World War II, now being deported how many years later. But getting back to Africa and the whole thing with China, Western powers can't really do anything where China is concerned going in and building up the economies of these countries, because that would mean going to war with China. And who wants that? right?
Interesting.
So going back to the situation of Africa and these African countries and kingdoms who were dealing with slavery, their whole focus is as long as it's not me.
Mm.
Because again, remember that these are separate individual nation states,
Mm-hmm.
right? If something is happening in Mexico, right, Canada is not going to send our defense forces down to go fight in Mexico if there's a because of the drug war that's going on.
Mm.
As long as the drugs stay out of Canada,
Mm.
right? And that is how
Right.
a lot of these countries had to operate. It's as long as the slave trade is not coming here, as long as we are not being enslaved.
Mm-hmm.
There's a film that I recommend you watch called Sarah. This is to tie up my point. And the film itself is about Queen Sahawina and her war against the French during the scramble for Africa. And
Mm-hmm.
they broached the subject about these different kingdoms who could have helped her when France invaded. But they were all
Right.
like, well, it's better them than us.
Mm.
Better they invade this pagan who doesn't share our religion than the French come here and interrupt our pure Islamic society. This isn't
Right.
me taking
Right.
sides with Islam. This is from the film, talking, having the kings and the sultans and the various rulers discuss the issue themselves,
Mm-hmm.
right? But then you have the prince of the Fula kingdom who said, religion and politics be damned.
Mm-hmm.
These are foreigners who are invading our land. And if they invade our land and they get hurt, how long until they come after us? Which was not a conversation, or at least the final decision that was being made. They were more concerned with preserving themselves. And
Right.
I don't like as much as hindsight is 2020,
Mm-hmm.
right? I can't blame them because they're working on the information that they have available to them.
True. True. Yeah, because when we think about it, right? Uh, they had again a sort of a limitation on how they understood the world, or just how far did the the borders of their kingdom extend. um, did they have an idea about the size of Europe? Did they have an idea about you know um, the Americas, and just like how vast that continent was, or those continents rather, right? These are certainly some questions that we have to consider. And you brought up another very important aspect of this, Brother Myrie, which was religion. When you mentioned about, um, for example, Islam, right? How that has to be considered when we think about whether Africans sold other Africans into slavery. Um, again, their perspective was sometimes, hey, I am a Muslim and you're not, especially in the northern region of the continent. And so you did mention that in Islam, there was a certain stipulation which basically said that, hey, there's certain people who are infidels, as they refer to, essentially people who are not Islamic, who are not of the faith. These people are strangers. And in a way, slavery, or enslavement rather, was seen as one of the ways to convert persons who were not of the faith into the tenets of Islam. And and so there's a book here, this book here, Transformations in Slavery, this one here by Paul Lovejoy. This is definitely a source I recommend on the subject. He definitely gets into some of the politics, where that's concerned in North Africa, and how that transformed the continent in that region.
Absolutely. And to dovetail to that point, early on during the period of colonization, Europeans were forbidden from enslaving other Christians.
Mm.
So what this meant was,
Right,
so this goes
right.
back to when Columbus had first encountered the Taínos, and Queen Isabella basically said, well, if you can convert them to Christianity, don't enslave them. And then he cooked up this whole story about them being cannibals and eating people. And so she says, well, you can enslave the cannibals. Everybody else, make them Christian.
Right. And then even further on, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this was in the 15th century. There were certain papal bulls which were announced. Those would be basically decrees from the Pope, who was the head of the Roman Catholic Church. These decrees basically stated that if those persons who were not Christian were enslavable.
Yeah.
Persons who were being encountered during this period, which is referred to as the Age of Exploration. And so those persons were not just people in the Americas, but also people on the continent of Africa. And that was used as sort of a pretext for the slave trade.
Exactly. And so that's sort of important to say. So when we look at I always sort of sum up my view on the entire conversation of the main question, which is, did Africans enslave other Africans? Mm-hmm. If you want to use it on the surface, at the surface level, yes, there was far too much evidence to say that they didn't, because it was African people getting, insert trade good here and, exchanging that trade good for a human being. Mm-hmm. Like, you can't get around that. And the fact that these industries have been around forever. But I think the nuanced side of that question is, we have to remember that not all Africans are the same. The same way we can accept that France and England are different countries, the same way we can accept that, because, a best example, England and Ireland, right? We're not looking at the situation between England and Ireland for that 800 years the Irish were oppressed and saying, well, that's just Europeans doing terrible things to Europeans. This is white on white violence. We don't say that. We understand fundamentally that these are two different cultures, civilizations, countries, kingdoms, however you want to define them. Mm-hmm. And one culture specifically is exercising a violent form of domination over another. Mm-hmm. And so we have to extend that same courtesy to Africa, to understand that, yes, in the strictest sense, people from Zaria were selling people from Nupe, or Africans were selling Africans. But in the more nuanced sense, we understand that the independent kingdom of Zaria, or Zozo, was selling people from the kingdom of Nupe because they were their enemies and they were fighting a war and they were not keeping anybody in prison.
Right. What about a kingdom like Benin? I'm sorry, not Benin, Dahomey, which is located in modern Benin. What about a kingdom like that? What do you say about that kingdom? It seems to me that for much of its history, they, were very much involved in trading, in capturing Africans from other, parts of the region, and basically selling them to Europeans as captives. Do you feel that, well, they saw what they were doing as us engaging in a business, as us basically selling other Africans, away from the continent, into slavery?
I'll throw this at you. When Rome fought Carthage in the Third Punic War, mm-hmm. Do you know what they did with the population?
The general population?
Yeah.
Was it slavery?
50,000 people sold into slavery after the burning of Carthage. 50,000 people. Now, for Rome, this was not a question of, we're going to get slaves from Carthage. We're going to burn the city to do it. It was, mm-hmm. We have an enemy that is across the Mediterranean that we need to neutralize. And the only way we're going to do that is by completely destroying that civilization. Mm. So they pack up all of their legions, they get on their boats, they cross the water, and they burn the city. Mm-hmm. And now they have 50,000 people. Their goal is depopulate the city so they can repopulate it and rebuild it in their own image. And the only way that they are going to be able to do that without the local population rising up against them is to sell them. Divide the people up, send them everywhere. So when the Dahomey are expanding, their goal is to exercise control over key areas in their sphere of influence. They want to be able to control this river. They want to be able to control this trade city. They want to be able to control this valley because it's very fertile, or this valley because it's got a lot of mines in it. And so they attack the people who are occupying that area. And they have two choices. They can risk a rebellion and leave all of the military-aged men to stay and eventually rise up against them, or they can half that population, ship them out to different slave ports, and in the process receive more firearms from their European trade partners, so that they're able to maintain power over the region and then expand further into more territory, so they can access more key economic routes.
Right.
So the narrative that Africans were just going after each other to get slaves and do that doesn't do justice to the complexity of the situation. The primary goal of the Dahomey was to get land, get territory, and get power. The way to maintain that was to depopulate the areas that they were fighting, or to completely find a way to get rid of the soldiers. And the other thing too is, if we're looking at the option of killing all of the soldiers that they capture, here's the problem with that. The first problem is, if the population that the next population that they're looking to take over realizes that the Dahomey are going to kill all of them, then they have two choices or three choices. They can either submit and join the kingdom, which is an ideal situation for the Dahomey, which is not going to happen. They could fight it out and fight to the death, which would mean more losses on the side of the Dahomey, which would make, because conflicts are expensive. Or they could just pack up and move.
True.
Just pack up and move and just not be there. And so, I mean, if they're considering the fact that there's going to be basically, a genocide happening, and then when you unalive a whole bunch of people in a population, you have all of these externalities to deal with. You have increased possibilities of disease, soil contamination. You have to deal with these 1,000 bodies that you've got to get rid of now, right? You might end up sparking a coalition of enemies against you, because they say, oh God, these people are going around, they're going after everybody. We should start a confederation, outnumber them, and overpower them. Right? So it's definitely more complex and nuanced, and we have to really think about the politics and not just the economics that underlie some of these decisions.
Right. I agree. I certainly agree. I feel, again, like that politics and economics thing. With Dahomey, I'm sure there was certainly an economic sort of a incentive, right? They were able to receive some weaponry, some of the technology that the Europeans had, which would have enabled them to further their own agendas, their own goals and aspirations, right? But then the political aspect of it is important to consider as well. And so there was another thing too. I wanted us to kind of touch on a little bit before we check the comments to see if there are any questions, and that is the aspect of coercion. In my research, what I found with Congo in particular, the ruler Alfonso I, basically he threatened he sent frantic letters to Portugal, telling the royal family that, hey, listen, you guys need to basically back off. We basically have persons coming to the kingdom, just grabbing people up and taking them away. But he also acknowledged that some of the very same people in his kingdom of Congo were participating in the trade, kidnapping, their neighbors and selling them, And so he was telling Portugal that, hey, we don't need you to send people here that are going to be doing these criminal, activities. Because first off, he was actually a Christian. Alfonso was a Christian, and So this reflected in his mind, this reflected very negatively on the religion, which he himself was adhering to. He was, he didn't see how any of this, fit in with what Christianity was teaching about loving your neighbor, and not killing each other, and etc. Right? And so he was telling the Portuguese that, hey, listen, we don't need merchants here. What we need is uh, we need people who are like teachers, people who are like ministers, doctors, people who are going to help to train our people here in Congo to be better citizens. Okay, um, and however, it didn't work out. Portugal, they basically ignored these pleas, um, and so with Congo in particular, Alfonso threatened to banish the Portuguese from his kingdom. This was in 1528. But towards the end of his reign, he actually survived an assassination attempt. He was at church when they tried to take him out. There was another king of Congo, Garcia. He was pushing more for Congolese control over the slave trade. And I feel that a lot of based on my research, there were a lot of instances in which African people were trying to have some kind of control over the trade. Because like you said, Brother Myrie, um, you know, they were not, slavery was not something that was alien to the continent. It wasn't something that, they've never seen it before. It's not something they're just not familiar. Um, and so, however, with that power dynamic, they did recognize that, hey, these Europeans were here. They were, trying to monopolize trade in general, and that was certainly a serious issue. With Congo, um, in 1794, there were kings that were punished because they were trying to resist the encroachment of the Europeans with the slave trade. Um, so, Brother Mari, how do we really interpret um, these findings in regards to um, the coercion aspect of it? We can see situations where Africans were forced in a situation where, hey, if you don't continue in the trade, then there are going to be certain repercussions. You mentioned Queen Nzinga of Angola, right? She was one of those persons who they came to, right? And they said, hey, listen, and I believe this was the Portuguese who were basically threatening her and saying, hey, you need to engage in the trade. The Dutch as well, who she formed alliances with, she had been trading with them. So what would you say about the level of coercion, Brother Mary?
So what I would say to that is it goes back to a point that I was making earlier, that you have something that started off small and snowballed into something big, right? Imagine you have a pet alligator, but you get a little thing like this. And you figure, okay, I'll throw him a couple of pieces of chicken a week. Won't be bad. Fast forward a few months later, now you have a 30-foot beast living in your bathroom, right? And that's essentially what slavery was. Now you have to feed this alligator or the alligator is going to eat you. So at first it was, we have these trade deals, great, we're going to send a few people we don't want on our borders over to the Europeans, they'll disappear, whatever. The Europeans took these people and used them to generate capital, wealth, technological development, etc., so on and so forth, to the point that now they had the numbers, the technology, and the logistics to make life very difficult for the countries that they wanted to target. Right? So yes, I agree, there is an element of coercion. And again, that it's not new. If you go back to the wars between the Rashidun Caliphate and the Kingdom of Myrie, that was the end result after the two battles of Dongola. They sent 300 something slaves up into Egypt every year, and whichever caliphate is in charge of Egypt will just not invade. Right? And considering the fact that Myrie was dealing with some economic issues, they didn't necessarily have the funding to fight a large-scale war with a caliphate that stretched all the way from Marrakesh to Cairo.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, I would argue that yes, there was an element of coercion, but it also depended on the kingdom, and it also depended on what their relationship was with the Europeans at the time. Because we do have evidence of people who resisted or people
Right.
who redirected the trade away from their borders.
Mm-hmm. So, is the understanding then, Brother Myrie, that were these Europeans holding a gun to their head? The persons who actually participated in the trade and said, "Hey, if you don't give us these slaves, then hey, we're going to take you out, or we're going to replace you, or we're going to take you all, all your family, all your vassals, your people." Was that situation? Because there are some people who make the case that first off, Europeans had not necessarily traveled in the interior of the continent and established any kind of outposts. Really, a lot of them had set up on the coast. Right, they set up their castles and their forts and the fortresses, and that's where they established themselves. And then the African people on the interior were, some of them, of course, were helping to carry the captives to the coast. So again, I mean, were the Europeans what was the level of force involved? And another aspect of it too, Brother Myrie, your background in research with the martial arts history, and I would definitely assume that involves as well some understanding of weaponry. Does your research suggest, Brother Myrie, that African people were helpless, in terms of, that power dynamic? Was a situation where Europeans were literally holding African nations hostage? Was that the general picture, or is that just maybe specific to certain regions, or what would you say to that?
It depends on when and where. I mean, by the time you get to the scramble for Africa, yes, because the gulf in technology has just gotten so wide that not only did, for example, the British Empire have more manpower and more logistics and more weapons than any of the African nations that they encountered. The African nations themselves had been so depleted by years of the slave trade and economic decline due to the fact that the things that used to make them rich were not making them rich anymore. So things like technological development would have been stunted because some of the most brilliant minds were being sent away, and they weren't able to. They were spending more time fighting wars than they were doing internal development.
Right.
Right. And part of the rough part about the war section, and I'll get into answer your question in a minute.
Right.
Usually, war is a major driver of innovations, but because many of those innovations were already provided and not locally developed, we're talking about warfare. The people don't get the economic benefit of creating new technology for the purposes of warfare, the same way that would happen in Europe or Asia. And this is because the answer to everything was more guns. It wasn't, how do I build a better gun? It wasn't, how do I build a fortress to protect me from this gun? The simple answer is, I need more guns. So if we go to these African countries, say, we're looking at the war between Zinga and her rival. I think it wasn't Makamba, it was another kingdom. But the argument isn't, oh, well, if you don't give us slaves, then we'll invade you. It's fine. If you don't want to do business with us, we know your neighbor will, and they'll be very happy to buy our firearms and invade you.
That's
because
right.
we know that they don't like you. So we will just arm your enemies against you. And that's exactly what happens now.
That's exactly what was happening. Yeah.
right? So it's less the question of they're not going to be afraid of 1 to 500 Portuguese traders with an arquebus, right? They're not that is not their concern. Their concern is the fact that the Portuguese could manufacture and distribute 10,000 muskets into the hands of their enemy who has 50,000 men he can take to the field,
Mhm.
right? That was their big concern. Because while the Europeans may not necessarily have had the physical numbers in the early and mid years of the period of slavery and colonization, they did have the manufacturing capacity to arm people to do the things that they wanted. That's how France ended up with so many Africans in their services. They said, "Look, we have the guns. Join us. We'll make you rich, and you can do whatever you want to whoever you want. Just work for us."
Right.
And that's largely what we're looking at.
So you're saying that even though, because again, there's people who suggest that African people, like during the time of the slave trades, gunpowder from Europe was not where it was during the time of the era of colonization, right? Because we talk about, for example, the invention of the machine gun, right? These automatic weapons or semi-automatic weapons. Um, I mean, for example, Hero Maxim, his gun would have been one of the earliest, if not the first. According to him, he was the inventor, right? Um,
Yeah.
so, however, during the slave trade, you're talking about these guys had these rifles, and sometimes you have to get up close for them to be, effective. They didn't have snipers, right? They didn't have some of the, you know, they didn't have drones, they didn't have none of what we have today, tanks. It wasn't that kind of situation. So my understanding is that African people, had the Europeans come to Africa like they did during the time of colonization and do kind of like whole scale invasions across the continent and say, hey, you're coming with me, um, you know, or you die. I don't think that would have been as effective
History
as
tells us that it wasn't. I mean, for example, when the Portuguese tried to invade Morocco at the Battle of Alcacer, the heir to the throne was killed and caused a succession crisis. And I'm not talking about the heir to the throne of Morocco, the heir to the throne of Portugal.
Mhm.
You have the Ajuran Portuguese Wars that happened, where the Portuguese essentially lost a major amount of power in the Mediterranean. You
Mhm.
have, all of the incursions against the Azande, the various wars that happened in West Africa between England and the Kingdom of Ghana.
Right.
Like, I mean, again, we're talking about the being able to just whole scale invade Africa and take things over was not working. And besides, Europeans were more focused on expanding in the Americas, where they met less resistance.
Mm.
Because remember, a lot of Africans were able to access firearms by purchasing it. Like if I'm from Ghana and I have a war with England and I need to get firearms, I don't have to buy these guns from Europeans. I can buy them from the Moroccans.
Right.
The Moroccans had been making cannons ever since cannons were cannons, right?
Yeah.
You have other countries in Africa that had at least up until the 18th century,
Mhm.
comparable military technology or enough weapons and armor and manpower to compensate for the technological difference against European countries. The
Right.
technology had to get really, really good in order for them to be able to just walk in and steamroll the continent.
Mhm.
And even then, there were countries like Ethiopia that got wind of what was going on and developed the technology themselves, and not developed the technology themselves, but acquired the technology.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? They were able to acquire the technology and defend themselves effectively.
Mhm.
So it's definitely more complex, right?
Right.
It's geopolitics. The same thing would happen in Europe. This one duke would say, "All right, well, I'm going to invade you. I'm going to pay this duke and this duke to invade you if you don't give me this piece of land that I'm after." Right? The Mongols did it all the time. They would say, "Pay us money, or we're going to burn your city to the ground."
Mhm.
Right? So it's a very common thing that used to happen. It's just the case in Africa, in my view, is not special in that regard. It's just
Right.
this is how geopolitics in those days worked. And in this particular case, that difference in geopolitics was driven by an economic desire and was taken to an extent that had never been seen before.
Mm, right. Right. Yeah, I certainly agree. I certainly agree. There was certainly a difference in terms of the strength of African militaries during that time and during the time of colonization. And the same is true for European militaries. Um, so I'm excited, brother Myrie, based on this information. It's very inspirational in a sense because even though the subject that we're discussing is a very contentious subject, even though it is also very sad, um, we can learn a lot from it, right? We can learn a lot from it, and exactly, in particular, how we can, what kind of lessons we can take from it, and how we can apply this to the present day, the situations that we are facing in this day and age.
Absolutely.
Mhm. What
So,
would
did we get any questions from the community?
Yeah, so um, we're gonna take a break before we get to the questions, the Q&A. But just kind of a final question, which would be, what are some lessons we can take from this in terms of the awareness of African people during this time period, of whether or not the other people they were selling, were brothers and sisters, whether they were fellow human beings, or whether they were, or whether, this action would have had some kind of repercussion for their community. What would you say to that, brother Myrie?
To put it simply, two things. Not everybody who brings you gifts is your friend, and not all skin folk are kinfolk.
Say it again, brother Myrie.
Not everybody who brings you gifts is your friend, and not all skin folk are your kinfolk.
Mm. Enough said. I agree. I certainly agree. In this day and age, just like in that time period, we do have people today who, we can consider to be opportunists, people who recognize that I can profit off of the suffering of another person. I can somehow gain from someone's suffering, from some exploitation. And just like you pointed out, Brother Myrie, some of these very same things are happening today. Places like Libya, right? If we consider the places where we get some of the products that we enjoy today, the clothing that we wear, right? Um, you know, uh, so many different things, even the technology, right? I mean, your cell phone, right? The car that you drive, all these things, in this interconnected world, we have to really acknowledge that, you know, some of the processes that go into these things are a sort of exploitation. And we have to really be able to identify these things. And we have to get to the point where we can take some sort of actions and think about how can we address these kinds of problems in this day and in this time.
Agreed.
Yeah, so we're going to go to break, and then when we get back, we'll take some questions from our audience.
Thank you.
And once again, everyone, Brother Myrie's book, Song of the Sunya. I'm sorry, Songs, plural. Songs of the Sunya. Get it today. It is available on Amazon. And definitely you want to follow Brother Myrie on his TikTok page. He's on Facebook. He also, as you can see there on the screen, he is part of the Historical African Martial Arts Association. So definitely follow that page and get acquainted with the work that Brother Myrie is doing in helping to enlighten our community. And so, Brother Myrie, thank you so much. Thanks again. And we're glad to have you. We hope to see you in round 2 of the Research Rumble.
Have a good night, man.
All right. You take care, Brother Myrie.
All right, I'm gonna hang up now.